Good morning, everyone. Just get organized here. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second roundtable of this morning. This roundtable is named Abortion Rights Lawfare in Latin America, and it's my absolute pleasure to moderate it today. This roundtable also marks the publication of a special issue on abortion lawfare in Latin America. It was published by Revista Direito de Ver, or Direito de Ver Law Review, in 2021, with special contributions of all our panelists today. This publication, which is online and open access, you have the link in the program, please access, is part of Law Transforms project, Sexual and Reproductive Rights Lawfare Global Battles, to which Rachel is going to talk a little bit more. But I would just like to add that there were actually 6 contributions that were published in the special issue. From Professor Lynn Morgan, discussing the case of Costa Rica, from City Glopen, discussing abortion lawfare, conceptualizing abortion lawfare, Amy Krause, discussing the case of Mexico City, Rachel Sieder y Jacobsin Bravo, discussing Mexican Supreme Court cases, Camila, Gianella, and Brenda Alvarez, discussing the Peruvian courts, and Maria Angelica Penas de Fago and Violeta Canovas, discussing the total ban in El Salvador, plus one article that will be published next month on abortion mobilization in Latin America, Signs of a Field in Transformation, that is co-authored by Marta, Camila, and Angelica. And I would also like to thank Marta, Camila, and Angelica for being the best co-editors that I had. So I'm the editor of the journal, and we worked together for several months, and it was a really great experience, and we're very, very happy to bring this to light. This roundtable will discuss the general research questions that animated that long and interesting research that they led here at Law Transform, as well as the recent developments both in Latin America and obviously with Roe v. Wade in the US. So without further ado, I would like to just briefly introduce the panelists today. Rachel Sieder is a research professor at the Center for Research and Graduate Studies in Social Anthropology, CIESAS, in Mexico City. Camila Gianella, and a research fellow at CMI. Camila Gianella is a professor at Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, and also a researcher at Law Transform. And Marta, my fellow colleague from FGV Law School in São Paulo, and also a researcher and a collaborator at Law Transform for a long time now. So I will first pass the word to Rachel, and then Camila and Martha, and then we'll open for Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Catalina. It's great to be here. I want to thank well, everybody that makes Law Transform and Bergen Exchanges possible, and it's great to be here. Catalina introduced who was in the project and the countries that we worked on, so I won't go over that, but just to say that abortion rights lawfare in Latin America was another of Siri's herding of many of us together and gave us, it wasn't an area that I had worked on, particularly before this project, and I think many collaborations have come out of it and new projects, and it's the project that keeps on giving. But what do we aim to do? We aim to analyze the strategic use of rights and law in battles over abortion rights in Latin America, and the various effects of what has been called lawfare between opposing groups, right? So as well as kind of the socially progressive, rights expanding kind of lawfare that many of us are actively engaged in, we also wanted to look at the counter-progressive use of the legal field. And we took rights to legal abortion as the point of inquiry to explore this tension and the dynamics between, and we struggle with the terminology between kind of progressive and counter-progressive, or what we were calling it, but these dynamics in Latin America. And we also really wanted to look at the regional dynamics, Latin America as a unit of analysis, and the transnational dimensions of this contested field. So we were looking at and drawing on literature, on networks, on epistemic communities, theories of norm diffusion, etc. Right? And so what I'm going to talk to is a little bit, it's more about what we found from Mexico, but hopefully we'll talk to kind of some of the concerns about the mosaic of progress and regression that we find in the region. So what did we find? Well, we documented extraordinarily sophisticated, multidimensional strategies by social movements and NGOs in many parts of the region that targeted not just the judiciary, but legislative and administrative sites for policymaking on women's sexual and reproductive rights. And as you probably all know, the thrust in Latin America on abortion rights and more broadly is on the prioritization of women's rights to health. Right? So abortion is framed through women's right to health rather than through questions of personal autonomy. So we have a very well documented first wave professionalized movement, including people in civil society, but then who move into the kind of into the state through what's called institutional feminism as the shorthand. And latterly, now, although that institutional feminism is still there in the state in many places, there's also a less institutionalized or less oriented towards the state. I was going to say less professionalized and not less professionalized, but it's a different orientation of activists working particularly against violence against women. So very important kind of movements against femicide, against anti-trans activism and violence, and the kind of alliances with the movement for women's sexual and reproductive rights, and these topics is really important now. And particularly thinking of Mexico, it's very much also a movement de la calle, on the street, of protest, not just kind of lobbying within the institutions of the state, right? And these movements are often very divided about strategy, and maybe Marta will talk to that for Brazil a little bit. So some favoring the kind of incremental expansion of the right to health and the effective enforcement of existing regimes of exceptions to the criminalization of abortion, so in cases of rape or incest, etc. So that's kind of been the traditional, if you like, stance versus, well, maybe not the traditional, but I'm going to simplify them into two kind of poles. One, the slow march, and the other, the kind of high stakes bets for decriminalization of abortion through the legislature. And there's the patterns that we see repeated across the region, and both strategies have been successful at different times and in different contexts. For Mexico, with Yacotzin Bravo Espinosa, we explored why we looked at Supreme Court framings on abortion cases and how those had changed over time, right? And in terms of the success of the movement, including Mexico, I guess the central point is, it's an obvious one, rights are not absolute. Rights to life since conception must be balanced against other constitutional rights and international rights related to women, specifically women's right to health, right? So the Mexican Supreme Court acts in line with regional trends, whereby constitutional courts have gradually enshrined this progressive understanding of right to life from the moment of conception, right? Which they view as a non-absolute right. And so emphasizing the need to balance the rights of the fetus. Well, a huge debate about whether a fetus actually has rights, or kind of that. I'm not going to have time to go into that debate here, but balancing against the rights of the mother and issues of maternal health. And this judicial balancing has produced a definitive position on the issue of prenatal life, which explicitly rejects this idea that the embryo of the fetus is a person, right? Mexico, probably many of you know the history, but Mexico decriminalized abortion to the 12th week in Mexico City's Legislative Assembly in 2007 and mandated the provision of free abortion in the capital. And what we looked at with Yakotzin in the project ran from 2014 to 2017, we explored what initially looked like it was a backlash, right? So what happened was there were right to life since conception amendments promoted in state constitutions at subnational level, and these were accompanied by increasing criminalization of women for abortion in some states in Mexico. And our findings for Mexico point to the importance of the federal systems as a factor in our analysis, right? So, and there's some really, really fantastic and important work coming out on this for Latin America for issues of violence against women and abortion, and I'm thinking particularly of the work that Alba Ruibal and Catalina Smulovitz have been doing on looking at trying to explain different outcomes at subnational levels. So we focus on the contentious politics of abortion, specifically on the circulation of legal frames between the Supreme Court and the national and subnational legislatures. So kind of what kind of conversation is happening there? And I think the interplay between Supreme Courts and subnational legislatures in federal systems, certainly for Latin America, but obviously for other places, is a key area of comparative inquiry. We wanted to do more comparative papers on this. With Ali Yamin, we were very keen on doing something on the US, obviously in Latin America, and we haven't had time. How much more time do I have? None.
There are 3 minutes?
3 minutes,
2
okay.
minutes.
In this conversation then, the question we had was kind of, was the Mexican court tone deaf? Right? In response to different cases of strategic litigation, what the Supreme Court in Mexico did was focus on the procedural, not on the substantive, right? So it's focusing on the nature of the federal pact and the balance of lawmaking powers between federal and state governments, right? So did state governments at subnational level have the rights to define rights or not? And you know, the outcome, I think you know. So it's a, so there was a limited degree of some kind of dialogic interaction, very much driven by the movement's analysis of the political and legal opportunity structures, and these have changed massively since the government of López Obrador and Morena was elected and came to power in 2018. So now, more than 10 years after this historic decriminalization of abortion in Mexico City, there's been a new push in state legislatures to decriminalize abortion, a successful push. So in 2019, Oaxaca decriminalized, 2021 Hidalgo, Veracruz, this year Guerrero. So now 9 out of the 32 states in the Mexican Federation have decriminalized abortion. So the Supreme Court was criticized for being too timid, but the story in Mexico does confirm that the court slowly, cautiously confirmed the rights of the federal government to set national health policies, with constitutional reform enshrining pro-persona progressivity principles so that rights couldn't be rolled back. I'm running out of time, what else to say? The importance of instruments to challenge gender violence in this story. So the importance of administrative procedures, right? Not just law and court judgments, but locking in women's right to health and abortion through administrative procedures and federal norms on health, right? So, for example, women who are raped do not now have to have a court order in order to access abortion, right? That's automatic provision of the healthcare system. And so the Mexican story kind of shows the importance of locking in at many different levels, and that was very much a strategy of the movement. Okay, concluding. The Supreme Court seemed to be largely reactive to different legislative initiatives and legal challenges, and it didn't produce the kind of powerful, substantive rulings that many would have liked. But it super important that it did slowly restrict. I mean, in 2007, it said the Mexico City government has the right to set its health policy. And by now, it's saying the states in the federation do not have the right to overturn federal norms to women's right to health. Right? And interestingly, I think the backlash strategy of the anti-movement, these constitutional amendments at state level affirming the right to life since conception and to the moment of natural death, didn't block the decriminalization of abortion and the expansion of women's sexual and reproductive rights services. So there wasn't an inhibiting effect. And that was also a big debate and a strategic decision by the movement, that wasn't the key contentious issue. I'm going to stop, but I just wanted to reference, I think what we would have liked to have done more through the project is really more rigorous comparative work. I think what the project ended up having was lots of lenius openings for more comparative work in the future. And some of that's been really developed very elegantly. I think I'm going to shout out the chapter by Alba Ruibal in Sandra and Dan and Ezequiel's book that we talked of yesterday, which looks at when counter movements gain traction and when they don't, right? And she talks about Brazil, this emblematic case of conservative forces in the legislature and the importance of interreligious caucuses, and Mexico, this pressure on subnational legislative processes. Colombia, Argentina, we can perhaps discuss more in questions. So sorry if I took more time, but thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Well, I think you opened for a lot of interesting things. I think we can talk a little bit more, perhaps, of the Colombian case on the second round. I know that there was something that you wanted to mention, but I would like to first pass the word to Camila. I will do the sad job of the moderator, and I'm going to keep the clock.
That's great.
In your purview.
Thank you for being here. Well, I want to say thank you for bringing us here and from Catarina and Marta for the idea of having the special issue. And there is a missing engine here that was Angelica, that was really part of the whole project of this special issue. And from the whole project of the abortion lawfare that we have running for some years. In this special issue, I wrote an article with a colleague from Peru, Brenda Alvarez, and what we try to do is like using, because the special issue also have an article from Siri Glopen when she presented her frame on this lawfare and where these legal battles happen. So we took the case of Peru and to try to explain why is in Peru not managing to go ahead on abortion rights. And so we try to see, okay, where is at the health services in a place that this is happening, the no progressive, I see they have the power to win there in a way. They have the medical doctors are conservative, the law is there is the national health law say that if you receive a patient with an incomplete abortion, you have to report them to the police, and that has not been challenged. So it's really difficult for even for the health staff that could be more open-minded to make something with the cases when they have the police there, especially in the public health facilities. And that has not been challenged by the court cases. Then you have the things happening at the legislative level, and we see there some trends that in one point there were some bills that were filed to try to, and discussed to try to provide more grounds to legal abortion in Peru, but they didn't have any political power. There was a minority even from the progressive left, but a minority within the progressive left, and not really space to open with other actors from the more center or democratic. So this was never go ahead. And there were some, as soon as they present some bills to try to provide more grounds, there were bills to provide more grounds to the unborn and to protect the health of the unborn and that kind of stuff that is still going on. So there was also no like a political thing, that power that allows to have a discussion at the political parties there. And then at the level of the executive, we see that these NGOs have the power to make some advocacy work with some key actors as some ministers, so the Minister of Health, the Minister of Women Affairs, and there they have some power to change some of the regulations, but that were not going to be implemented if you don't have the support of the health system. So that was a little bit tricky. And at the level of the judicial, then we went to the judiciary and tried to understand what was going on at the level of the judiciary, where there were also cases against the small things that they were advanced, as the therapeutic abortion guidelines. We say the no progressive file cases against these therapeutic abortion guidelines, and they lose in courts. But we also studied a case of the woman that was, an adolescent that was criminalized for having an incomplete abortion in Peru, and to see what, and there we try to understand what are the arguments used by the courts, first by the attorneys, and in the first instance and the lower courts, what was the arguments to say, yeah, this is a criminal case, she has to be prosecuted and sent to jail, and then at the superior court, they won. And what we found, I think that was the most interesting thing, and in a way limits the capacity of these NGOs to advance, is that the state doesn't really want, the executive doesn't really want to have the fight for this. But they say, okay, you want to come and to make all the legal work, so the feminists have to, as lawyers, go and to support the Ministry of Health to protect the guidelines at the courts, and so they are part of the defense of the state. Then it's really difficult for them to ask for more ground for abortion through the courts, to ask to fight with the Minister of Health or with the Minister of Women Affairs to say, you have to say why the CIESAS told to us, because they are working together to protect the guidelines in a way. And that is also because they don't have any kind of political power at other levels, or capacity to make advocacy at other levels. And then there can be some things that were more or less positive, or not really, because that is really unstable and precarious, is that the judges at the superior courts in Peru, they are not really innovative, so they are not really like creating stuff. No, they just follow what the executive said or what these international bodies say. So they say, we cannot go against that, and if the executive say this is okay. We are not going against that. And but that is precarious, because if you really have a change in the executive, then the judges are also going to comply with that. So that is, and then we say, okay, that is the case of Peru, and probably that explains why we have not been able to expand the ground of abortion, even though we have this positive development for Peru at the international bodies. Yeah, I will leave it there. Yeah, it's okay. So we have more time for discussion.
Thank you, Camila. Marta?
Well, I'm really thankful for being here, and I must thank Sieder and Rachel for inviting me to this research. Was the first research I did together in this group, in the Law Transform Center, and today it's one of my main areas of research, and you brought me into that. So basically, I was responsible for the Brazilian case study, and what I did was researching and reconstructing the political process on abortion rights disputes in Brazil, going from the debates on the Constitutional Assembly, and even the disputes within the feminist movement and the lipstick lobby, because abortion was very controversial even for the feminist groups, going to, at that moment, in the project to 2016, when the impeachment process happened, and it had a very misogynistic undertone, and also it was also the moment that Michel Temer, who took power after Dilma, put a pro-abortion, an anti-abortion congresswoman in the Secretary of Women. So what I'm doing now is trying to see what happened afterwards, and especially looking to the Bolsonaro government. But we were really aiming to see like the whole, it was very ambitious, so we have a lot of data until unexplored, so we wanted to see pro and anti-abortion movements and how they were in a relational way and how they were moving in different arenas. So we were covering the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary, and also informal protests and campaigns. So we have a data bank on bills and administrative acts, campaigns, judicial cases, and a lot of interviews with actors. But it was really interesting is that researching the abortion, we could kind of see what was coming with Bolsonaro. So in the project, we saw that the turning point on the abortion field was like 10 years ago. It was 10 years before what exploded in the Brazilian public sphere in 2015 in Bolsonaro. So that was a very privileged standpoint to see the national politics. And what we saw was an arch going from when the abortion, in the first mandate of Lula, when pro-abortion or pro-choice or feminist movements were in an alliance with the federal movement, and Lula, in fact, put the main activists, pro-women health activists, as in the Ministry of Health, where she could advance a lot, all the network of women care and referral centers, and really expanding the access to abortion rights, to what we see. And then there was, so the problem, the turning point was exactly in 2005, when after she had advanced all the way she could within the legal limits of abortion rights, which was permitted in Brazil in case of rape and risk to the life of women. And then in 2005, there was a moment that she said, okay, to advance here, we need to have a law to decriminalize abortion. And then the executive, which was very powerful at the moment, presented a bill in the Congress and supported a bill in the Congress to pass a law decriminalizing abortion. So at that very moment, at that exactly year, the corruption scandal of Mensalão came out, and that all the plan, and that destroyed all that plan, because Lula had to reconstruct his bases with the Catholic Church, with the Conservative Congress, and it was also not a very popular subject to face society. So the executive stood back from the proposal, and when the conservatives saw that we got to a point that almost decriminalize abortion, that triggered a huge reaction in the anti-abortion field, and they renewed completely their strategies. Which is like an experimental field to see what came afterward, because the strategies we see in the anti-abortion fields are now also the strategies we see in the whole alliance of conservative Brazilian fields. So at that moment, that it was the end of the alliance between state and Brazilian pro-choice movement, the anti-abortion field, started to do, well, first of all, in 2006, they formed a parliamentary front in defense of life. So parliamentary fronts were like a new structure that became very important in the Bolsonaro government, since Bolsonaro has a very weak relation with party. He was in the beginning of the government at least, relying on this very conservative, in this alliance between conservative parliamentary fronts. We have this BBB alliance in Brazil, which is boi, cattle, so anti-environmental policies, and boi, Biblia, so Bible, and bala, so gun liberalization's interests. So they form a very conservative alliance in the Bolsonaro government, and we see in 2006 a very strong movement to form the first parliamentary front in defense of life. At that same moment, they've also created a national movement of citizenship for life, Brazil without abortion movement, and it was a huge, the first time, it was a huge difference in the mobilization field when we have, before that, the main anti-abortion actor in Brazil was the National Council of Bishops in Brazil, basically the Catholic Church acting through lobbying authorities, and after that, they started a huge social movement, like really ingrained in society. So they would convene, they would have throughout the country small organizations that would be allied to churches, but would also be NGOs and pro-life NGOs, and they would convene annual massive marches in defense of life, campaigns, and etc. So we really had the first conservative movement emulating all the progressive movements, all the strategies used by the progressive movement so far. And that happened in 2006 in the anti-abortion movement, and that was broadened in scope in 2015 in the movement that supported the impeachment. At that moment, also, there was like a strong influence, anti-abortion influence, in the electoral campaign. So they were in 2000. We had an election in 2006, and they were massively campaigning, decide for life, don't vote, yes for life, abortion never, don't vote for candidates that support abortion, etc. So, and then the electoral use of abortion and anti-gender in general discourses was also a strong feature of the election, the 2018 election when Bolsonaro was elected. So what we came out, is it, yeah, 1 minute? So I just wanted to, one of well, just since I have 1 minute. Okay.
A little bit more than 1 minute. I'll give you.
So I think what was interesting to see was the totally renewal of the anti-abortion field with that moment. So first of all, they expanded the field enormously from an anti-abortion agenda to an anti-gender ideology agenda, which allowed to them to expand the alliances. So they converted from very elitist, one organization doing advocacy to a real social movement, really ingrained in society. They were they had a strong alliance with the political branch, because they had from one side the social movement, and from the other side a strong alliance with the evangelicals in power, and a very professionalized way of acting, inserted in transnational networks. And one thing that I think is really interesting is that they made extensively use of the language of rights and litigation. And we see in the abortion field what we now see in general, like the dispute of the human rights language, the disputes of freedom of conscience, of freedom of religions, and that makes that allow us to see how all the progressive tools and litigations and rights, how they play out when they are appropriated and disputed by conservatives, which is something that that's really interesting for who is researching legal mobilization, but also it makes a lot of, it brings a lot of reflection for the human rights field itself, that we were all thinking that human rights were progressive tools and would never be used in the other way around, and also question what's the limits of individual rights or individual freedoms, and and also the limits of the strategies that we had through legal means. So I'm sorry, when we have too much to say, it's difficult to summarize, but I hope we can have a longer conversation.
No, it was great. Thank you so much, Marta. I mean, I know the story. I'm particularly interested in that story, but I always find it fascinating to see you recount it and how it was like a laboratory, like kind of experiment of how the strategies that we saw and spread it elsewhere in other areas of Brazilian political life, right? Well, I will open to questions, but before that, I just wanted to pinpoint a few things that we talked before, so, and I think you didn't have a chance to address, right? I just wanted to remind, I was thinking, obviously, we had two very important facts into 2022, for Latin America in particular. Colombia's constitutional court legalizing abortion during the first 24 weeks of pregnancy, putting Colombia as one of the most progressive countries in the subject. But also we had Roe versus Wade. And one of the things we were talking before, right, the roundtable was like, how does the research and the findings that you had in 2017, how would that look like in face of these two very important things? One at a regional level, but one that it's inevitably, to some extent, might affect other jurisdictions and other countries and other contexts. And I think Marta already gave a clue, right? So transnational sharing of a strategy on a transnational level with Roe v. Wade might give ideas to Brazilian right-wing movements on the ground of how they should go about things. This is the first one. And the other one is like, regarding the difference between how this happened in certain countries in Latin America through the legislative branch and through constitutional courts. Do you think there is a relevance in that? Does that make it more safer, less safe? Like, how do you analyze that, and how did that pin out in these different countries and case studies that you've worked on? So that's the privilege of being the moderator. So now I'm going to open for questions. Ruth, Lisa.
Thank you. It's on. It's on? Yes. Okay. So I just to follow up on your last comment and to turn it around a bit, because I agree with you that the backlash is global. In fact, these groups are speaking to each other, they're funding each other. So I totally think that the transnational women's movement should have those kinds of conversation and learn from each other. But I also think that maybe, the constitutionalism of the region that Rachel was summarizing maybe has something to contribute to our American colleagues in current times. The irony is that because the US had this early enshrining of a constitutional right to abortion, which Europe didn't have, and Latin America didn't have, because it started exactly from the opposite position. It started by foregrounding the position of the fetus. And yes, there's debate as to whether the fetus is a rights holder or not, but the general consensus is that, life since conception deserves some form of constitutional protection. But from that, what we have seen is a whole evolution that says many things. That says, for instance, well, the fact that you need to protect the fetus doesn't necessarily mean that you have to or can criminalize women, because there is various forms of preventing abortions, including by preventing unwanted pregnancies or by creating a more reproduction-friendly society. So there's other forms, and proportionality demands certain standards. So the fact that you don't have a right to abortion doesn't mean that you can, that you cannot ground constitutionally exceptions to a possible ban on abortions, and we have a whole tradition in Europe and in Latin America about that. So I think that, and of course the whole question of access, in which Latin American constitutionalism has clearly led, right? Because the windows were narrow, a lot of emphasis was put on actual removal of obstacles. And there's a long-standing criticism in US constitutionalism about the limits of the privacy framework of the abortion right. So what I'm trying to say is that maybe this is also a time, suddenly the Roe net is gone and the legislature doesn't seem quite able to come to the rescue. But in European and Latin American constitutionalism that started from the other end, right? Especially now that you read in the New York Times, fetal, the new ideas about enshrining the protection, the constitution of the fetus. Well, we have a long history of constitutionalism that has done that, and in spite of that, has found ways of carving out constitutional protection for women in this domain. So maybe the conversation now needs to be south to north and not just north to south.
Lisa.
So, thank you. Thanks for a great panel and fantastic discussion. And also, you really just threw me in a route because that just made me think. And thanks for a super intervention that I need to think about. My thoughts were not so smart, when you talked, Marta, I had two books in my mind. The one is Rosenberg's Hollow Hope, and the second one is Roberto's Conversations Among Equals. That was not the title, but you know what I mean. And here's so this is my question. If some of you have time to reflect on this, I'm thinking about the 1988 Constitution in Brazil, which was very liberal and very, one of the most modern constitutions in the world in terms of social and economic, including social and economic rights and liberty. Is what we're seeing in Brazil, is it sort of a Rosenberg story of a hollow hope, where a constitution is, in a sense, too modern, too mature for its own people, in a sense? Then, if possible, can you tell me a little bit, any of you, about the constitutional moment in Colombia? I'm wondering if the Colombian constitutional process has some of those elements that Roberto was calling for yesterday, a conversation among equal. What I'm asking, is it possible that we have come to a moment where we do produce laws that are based on social movements and based on social conversations, and is there a difference? So in a sense, did 1988 happen with too little social movements and protection from and participation from civil society in a sense? And then I'm wondering, in a sense, could we see, is the Colombian moment different? I think my hope is that we are having more of a Roberto time and less of a Rosenberg time, but can I ask you to reflect on that if possible, those two constitutional moments? A very long question. Sorry, it wasn't very coherent.
Do we have time for one more because we have 10 minutes, so yeah. So Marta is telling me one more.
I'll do my best to keep it brief. So thanks so much for the fascinating discussion, and I have two minor questions for all three panelists, and namely, the first one, a very broad one, I guess, but that came to my mind. So what, in your view, how did the medical dimension play out in all of this? Because this is a health issue as well, right? And we did have, at least in Mexico and I suspect elsewhere as well, we did have a big participation by the medical community in, offering, for instance, excerpt briefs to the court, and first in order to define where, well, can we speak of life from a medical perspective within the first 12 weeks of pregnancy. And so how did this play out in the eventual debates that have taken place in each country, though this technical medical dimension that tilts the debate one way or another? And the second question, closely related there too, so how do you see this also playing out in counter movements as well, right? When there might be a divergence in perspectives, for instance, with conscientious objectors, right? And those medical practitioners that refuse to perform abortion, and the laws somehow give room for this to happen with limitations, of course. So how do you see this playing out? Thank you.
One more question, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for such a wonderful panel. I'm really speechless on your findings. And I just want to pose a very, very brief question. Could you please elaborate a bit more how the textures of class, of particularly race and ethnicity play out, not only in the social mobilization, but also on how judicial reasoning came about? Because we all know that these issues are intertwined, and sometimes I feel that they are not outspoken in the case of Latin America. Brazil may be the exception, for example. But thank you.
Thank you very much. So if you may just...
How long have we got?
Pick and choose. 7 minutes in total to finish.
For all of us. Okay.
Yeah, for all of you.
All right.
So if you could pick and choose some of the issues and address it, and then do like a little closing remark.
So many issues,
yeah,
and that's why it's such a fascinating project, and that's why we're having such trouble summarizing our findings for you in a panel. But obviously, all kinds of, I mean, one of the big questions and the big comparative questions is like, who weaponizes abortion, when, how, the importance of evangelical movement, transnational sharing, terribly important, you know, the analysis of legal and political opportunity structures together, and the pro-rights movement in Latin America is extraordinarily good at that analysis, right? It is, you know, really impressive. It's also made up of elite actors, right, as well. So that's a factor, and it's not the same as kind of, you know, struggling for indigenous land rights, for example. Right? So one thing to say, Ruth, yes, absolutely. South to north, ojalá. It would be, yeah, it is terribly important. There's this contribution of Latin American constitutionalism, obviously right to health, obviously importance of the inter-American system and the interplay between the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and what happens in the individual countries is a big part of the story. I think the other thing that I also wanted to say that I missed out in my introductory comments is, like, and coming back to Roberto's points from yesterday, the importance of the street, right? We are in the middle of, you know, la marea verde, the green wave, it is one of the most important social movements that we have ever seen in my lifetime in Latin America. And, you know, for the Argentina decriminalization of abortion, which was tried and finally succeeds, and, you know, mobilization of a new generation of activists is super important for that story. But yes, in terms of the contribution of Latin American constitutionalism on the balancing, on the removal of obstacles, terribly important story, which I hope that you can amplify in all of this work with, fabulous work that you're doing on constitutionalism. What else to say? Pedro, yes, absolutely. It's astounding to me that the first ever expert witness report brief to go to the Mexico Supreme Court, the first ever to the Supreme Court, was by doctors on rights to health and in the public hearings on abortion in Mexico City 2007, 2008. On the question of conscientious objection, yeah, they thought of that as well, and that's about locking it into administrative health provisions. So yes, doctors have a right to conscientious objection if they don't want to perform abortion, but the health system has to provide an alternative cover for women that are seeking abortion services, right? So, you know, there's no blocking of conscientious objection. It's not a big factor. I tried to do some work on it in Mexico. I really couldn't find very many. You know, the way that these get locked in, it doesn't mean free abortion on demand provision in Mexico is fabulous either, and, you know, the exclusions in terms of race, class, in service provision, access, we could have a whole nother conversation about that, but yeah, locking in through health norms, federal health norms and administrative provisions has been obviously super important in this story. I'm going to stop because I'm sure I took more than 2 minutes.
Yeah, trying to answer to Lisa. I think that to understand the Colombian case, okay, Sandra, you're here, so probably you can correct me afterwards or kill me or what I want to say, but I think that they have the case in 2006 and they won that case and they have a lot of problems with the implementation. And I will say that in the case of Colombia, at the beginning they have the same problem. That was super elitist. And that was not really grassroots. That was this idea of the strategic litigation is going to change everything. And then come also the peace agreement and the swap off in the face on this issue of gender and all the movement, and there was a thing across the region on the thing against gender ideology that was used on the discussion of the peace agreement. And I think that shake the whole thing and to see that they need to have a more open debate and to have other kind of debates also with the organization and how people that were affected by has been affected by sexual violence during the conflict, and to try to link this with other agendas and just stop with thinking, so to have this more open understanding. And I think the example of Argentina is more or less the same. I mean, you have, it's not just of course, I mean, there were cases in the courts and from before, from the feminist lawyers that were trying to fight this at the courts, but they also have the encuentros feministas with the unions and to put abortion in the agenda of the unions and to put this at that level, that allowed to have a more democratic and to put these things on other agendas and not only in this small bubble of like, yeah, feminists super specialized on this issue. So I think that is the thing that we are lacking in other parts, and in the case of, I would say in the case of Peru, we don't have that. And with the medical doctors, it's the same. I mean, they train medical doctors, but you don't discuss the issues of power with medical doctors. And they are okay if they can decide on abortion, not when the woman has to decide. So the guidelines in Peru are impossible to apply because they were written by medical doctors that are supposed to be the sensitive one, but they are the ones that want to decide everything. And they only have the experience of the super specialized hospital in Lima. So how to implement that in region that we don't have specialists is impossible. But they don't care because it's where they feel comfortable is when they have the absolute control of the decision of the whole thing. So, and then this, I think, something that we have to speak more with the medical doctors.
I have 1 minute, I think, so I just say a word about the Constitution and health, because they come together. I think the social feature of the Constitution and the importance given to the right to health as a universal right was essential to form the pro-abortion movement. I've been, in fact, having a hard time to name the Brazilian pro-abortion movement because we cannot name it as a pro-choice, because choice, the autonomy, like the individual framing of rights that we see in the US, was not used by the Brazilian movement. It was basically framed on right to health, right to public health, and that so the Brazilian, so that was an alliance between feminist and public health movement, because in Brazil we also had, because of the Constitution, a strong public health social movement with doctors and social mobilization with doctors, etc. So that was an alliance, and health played a very essential role. And all the advances we had throughout the decades was through the public health system, through the creation of a women health and the expansion of that network, and that it's what is being hollowed out and dismantled in very subtle ways by a government that is now self-declared as a pro-life government and even put abortion total ban as an official goal to the movement. But while it's interesting to see that while the Congress is still very conservative, to date he didn't manage to pass a law of abortion total ban, but he's really emptying the whole public health system with, and all this movement has an affinity and goes together with the attacks to our constitution and to its social filters. So the destruction of the health, the destruction of the women network and legal abortion networks goes together with the destruction of our social state and our public health system. So I think there's a lot to think on the abortion field. Also gives a lot to think about what different made that we have this constitution with that social character and the role of the health system to our country.
Thank you so much, Marta. I think we end on a note of a lot of questions, but we have the chance to continue this conversation in the next roundtable. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.